In 2010, Erdman's published my book, Remember the Poor, Paul, Poverty, and the Greco-Roman World. And that book was intended to take on the consensus view, or we might call it the myth, that Paul's gospel had very little interest in poverty, the poverty that was all around him in the Greco-Roman world. And so the origins of that book lie in a course that I gave at Cambridge University between 1995 and 98 when I was there. I gave an exegesis course on Galatians. And whenever we came to Galatians 2:10, this is in the context where Paul is meeting with the Jerusalem apostles, and they all agree that yes, Paul can take the gospel to the Gentile world without the requirement of circumcision. The one thing that they ask of Paul and Barnabas is that they remember the poor. And I said, whenever you look at a commentary on this, you'll see that the phrase remember the poor means send money to us in Jerusalem, because we have a lot of poor people in our communities. And so I said to my students, you'll find that view articulated in almost every commentary, but what you won't find is the argumentation for it. The argument seems to have been lost, and all we're stuck with is the conclusion, but I'm sure the argument is there somewhere, and I told them it's going to be my job someday to try to find the argumentation that supports the conclusion that the poor are actually the Jerusalem poor. And as I started this little research project, which I thought would be a very short essay somewhere, it dawned on me that actually there is very little argumentation supporting this, and what argumentation does support this conclusion is actually wrong. And so it began to reframe the episode. What are the Jerusalem apostles saying to Paul and Barnabas when they say, yes, go out, take the gospel to the Gentile world? Circumcision is not required, but what is required is that you remember the poor. And it dawned on me that the phrase actually means remember the indigenous poor. And that what they're doing is they're saying unity in Christ is established as faith in Christ is fostered in communities, either in the Jewish context, where Christians will continue to be circumcised, or in Gentile communities, where Christians will not need to be circumcised. But what unites them is not only faith in Christ, but also the kind of care and self-giving that Jews were already and always known to be doing in and among themselves. And now the Gentile communities are to be doing that as well, taking care of the economically disadvantaged. And Paul says this is exactly the sort of thing that I was eager to be doing anyway. And then we start to use that as a frame to look around in Paul's letters, and we see little phrases here and there, usually at the end of letters, where he says things like care for the needy. Now, he doesn't say care for the poor specifically, but in Paul's world, who are the needy? If we think it doesn't include the economically disadvantaged, we'd be fooling ourselves. It doesn't mean they're exclusively the economically disadvantaged, but the needy must certainly include that. And he says things in various letters, probably the majority of them, along these lines. Remember those who are in need, offset the needs of those who are disadvantaged, things of this sort, letter after letter. And then we recognize that in something like 1 Corinthians 11, where the Corinthians are getting their practice of the Lord's Supper wrong, and it looks like there's an economic distortion going on in the community. That's there that Paul, in a sense, lays down the law without holding any of his punches, and basically says you've distorted the whole function of this supper, the Lord's Supper. And for you, it's no longer the Lord's Supper because the economic configuration has been so distorted. And God is disciplining you, etc. So when you look at things in this frame of reference, you see that actually caring for the poor, while it wasn't the forefront, the shop window of Paul's ministry and message and theology, it was a component within it, and an obvious component in a gospel about a Messiah who gives of himself for the benefit of others, and that the others become transformed to look very much like he himself. So this is the myth that I, in a sense, took on and tried to dispel, that Paul's gospel really had nothing to do with the poor and the poverty that was everywhere around him. There's a lot of nuancing that we need to talk about, but the myth, I think, is busted.